I came to realize a painful truth. Some people stand beside a hospital bed not out of love, but because they are waiting for the door to an inheritance to open. I thought that was the lowest point of my life. But then, in the darkest stretch of that time, something gentle arrived, very quietly. And I had no idea that the person who was about to change everything would be a complete stranger. And then, in the darkest stretch of that time, something gentle arrived quietly. I met that young woman at the clinic. My husband had a checkup that day. He was more tired than usual, so I took him in early. The waiting room looked the same as always: rows of plastic chairs, cold white lights, the faint smell of disinfectant in the air, people coughing, the receptionist calling out names. In places like that, everyone is carrying their own fear, so very few people have any energy left to notice anyone else. But I noticed her. She was young, maybe 25, thin, pale, her hair tied back in a rushed little ponytail. She was wearing the kind of ordinary clothes nobody would remember after passing by. Beside her was a little girl, probably elementary school age, holding an old cloth doll in her arms. The child had been running a light fever for a few days, and the young woman had brought her in. I only know that because after a while, the little girl was the one who started talking to my husband first. She asked him why he kept coughing so much. A man that tired could have just smiled and let it go. But my husband had always been especially gentle with children. He told her it was because his lungs weren't behaving, so the doctor needed to check and see just how stubborn they were being. The little girl laughed. Then the two of them started chatting as if there were no hospital smell, no anxious faces, no shadow of illness hanging over our heads. The young woman shyly apologized and said the little girl talked a lot. My husband said it was fine, that sometimes a child talking too much is the best thing in a place like that. That was the first time. After that, we ran into each other a few more times at the clinic. I suppose life still has a little kindness left in it when it lets people cross paths again at exactly the moment they need to, even if none of them knows it the first time. Eventually, she learned that my husband had lung cancer, and I slowly learned more about her too. She was a single mother, worked 2 jobs a day to pay for rent, bills, food, medicine, everything. One job in the morning, another at night. Some young people still carry that light, carefree look of a life that hasn't hit them too hard yet. She wasn't like that. There was a very clear weariness in her, the weariness of someone used to carrying everything on her own. But strangely, all that hardship hadn't hardened her. It hadn't taken the gentleness out of her. She started stopping by to visit us. At first, it was only once or twice, briefly, a small bouquet, a container of hot soup, a simple question: "How's he doing today?" After that, her presence gradually became part of those hospital months in such a natural way that it almost felt like she had always been there. There were nights when I could barely keep my eyes open for one more minute, and she sat with my husband so I could go home and shower for a bit. There were days when I was tangled up in paperwork, and by the time I came back, she had already adjusted his blanket. There were times when I fell asleep, slumped over on a hard hallway chair, and when I woke up, there was a cup of coffee still warm beside me, and she was sitting there quietly, like none of it was anything worth mentioning. I never had to beg for that help. She just did it, quietly. And that was exactly what made it catch in my throat. Because sometimes strangers give us the very thing blood family holds back the hardest: their presence. Her little girl started coming by with her sometimes on weekends, too, especially when my husband was a little more stable and we were at home instead of in the hospital. The child loved his study. More specifically, what she loved most was the old bookshelf against the wall, where my husband kept a collection of cheap paperback novels he had picked up over many years. They weren't valuable books, not rare books, just old paperbacks with yellowing pages, worn spines, wrinkled covers. The kind of books you find in thrift stores or bargain bins for next to nothing. But he loved them, and the little girl loved them too, with that wholehearted devotion only children really know how to give. She would sit cross-legged on the rug, carefully opening them one by one, like she was afraid of hurting the old pages. One time she looked up and asked my husband why a character in one of the stories had behaved that way. And he, this man who had been living with constant pain, this man usually too tired to talk much, suddenly talked to her for a long time. He told her about the story, the character, the days when people used to buy cheap books from roadside stands. She listened, completely absorbed. I stood in the doorway watching and realized it had been a very long time since I had seen a truly peaceful look on his face. Illness had not spared his body, but in moments like that, it still had not taken all of him. One day, the little girl hugged 3 books to her chest and asked very softly, "Can I read these again someday?" My husband smiled, a very small smile, but a real one. He said, "If you love them, then someday you can take all of them. Books are meant to be kept by the people who truly love them." I heard him say that. I remember it very clearly. And later, I remembered it so clearly it hurt. But before we got to that day, there was still another humiliation waiting for me at the hospital. After months of being almost completely absent, his children started showing up more unpredictably once his condition got worse. Not the way people come when they're worried about their father, not the kind of entrance where they walk into a hospital room with fear on their face and the first thing out of their mouth is, "How is Dad today?" No, they came with something much colder than that. I knew it the first time. That day, the doctor came into the room to discuss the next treatment plan. I had been there since morning. I had written down his symptoms, answered questions about the medication, his sleep, the nighttime shortness of breath. By then I did all of that almost on instinct. My life had shrunk down to one hospital bed and all the things I needed to remember to make his pain even a little more bearable. Then the door opened. His son and daughter walked in. I wasn't surprised that they came. I was surprised by their eyes. There was not one trace of softness in them. Nothing in their faces looked like the faces of children standing beside their father at the edge of life and death. It was just this guarded irritation, like they were late to an important meeting they should have been present for from the start. The doctor had barely finished a few sentences when his son interrupted. Right there in front of me, in front of the doctor, in front of the nurse, he flat out said that they were the patient's biological children, so any important decisions needed to go through them. Not asked, not suggested, declared. I remember exactly how that felt. I was standing right beside my husband's bed, my hand still resting on the back of the chair, listening to a boy I had lived with for years talk about me like I was some temporary person in the room, some woman who had wedged herself into a place where she didn't belong. He didn't have to raise his voice. The most humiliating things never need to be loud. They just have to be cold enough, clear enough, final enough. His daughter backed him up. She said, in so many words, that they needed to know everything exactly, that from now on they wanted the hospital speaking directly with them. The meaning was obvious. I shouldn't be the one in the middle. I could have gotten angry. A lot of people probably would have. But what I felt in that moment was somehow worse than anger. I felt pushed out of the life of the man I had spent 3 years caring for, right there in the hospital room where I had practically lived more than I had at home. The doctor, thank God, was a decent man. He looked at me, then at my husband, and asked very calmly who the patient wanted as his primary representative for medical decisions. My husband was very weak, but he still opened his eyes. I will remember that look for the rest of my life. Tired, in pain, but lit by something that looked a lot like the last of his dignity. He looked straight at the doctor, then tilted his head slightly toward me. "My wife," he said. Just 2 words, but I saw his son's face tighten. He looked away. And I stood there, trying not to show that those 2 words alone were enough to make me want to cry right there in the hospital room. That night, he was so exhausted he could barely speak. I thought he had fallen asleep, so I stepped into the hallway to call my daughter and tell her stepfather was having a very weak day. When I came back, the door to the room was half closed. I heard voices inside. It was his children. They were in there. They must have thought he was asleep or no longer alert enough to understand. I didn't go in right away, not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because there was something in their voices that made me freeze where I stood. His son said that the important thing was making sure everything got sorted out before it was too late. His daughter answered with a sentence that still sends a chill through me whenever I remember it. She said that if he left everything to me, then it meant he had chosen me over his own children. And then, in that dry, awful tone, one of them said he had stopped being their father a long time ago. I can't remember exactly which one said that first. Maybe because in that exact moment, every sound in my head turned into one thick, ringing hum. All I know is that I stood there, one hand still holding my phone, staring through that narrow crack in the door, and the only thought in my mind was this: how can a person say things like that about their own father while standing beside his hospital bed? I pushed the door open and walked in. They both turned around, their faces changing instantly, but I didn't say a word. I didn't want to make a scene in a room where a dying man was lying in bed. I just walked straight over to him. My husband was still lying there, eyes closed. I didn't know whether he had heard them or not. They stayed a few more minutes, then left, taking with them that freezing cold atmosphere they always seemed to leave behind. I sat down beside his bed and took his hand in mine. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't say anything. But I felt his fingers tighten around mine, just slightly. And that was enough for me to understand. He had heard. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. The hospital room was dark, with only a dim strip of light coming in from the hallway through the crack in the door. The machines hummed steadily. A nurse's cartwheels faded away and then came closer again. My husband barely slept. Neither did I. Just before dawn, when the disease had drained him so completely that every sentence cost him breath, he turned his head very slightly toward me. I leaned down so I could hear him better. He said, "I'm sorry." I asked him what he was apologizing for. It took him a while before he could keep going. Every word was slow, broken, like even his body was resisting having to say something that painful out loud. I waited too long, believing they would get better. I bit down hard on my lip. I knew if I opened my mouth right then, I would start crying. He closed his eyes for a moment, then said, "While I was waiting, you were the one paying the price." I lowered my head onto his hand. Some apologies cannot fix anything anymore, but that doesn't make them hurt less. If anything, it makes them hurt more. Because when nothing can be repaired anymore, every honest admission cuts like a slow blade. I don't know how long I sat there like that. I only remember that by the time morning fully came, I looked up and saw that something in his face had changed. Not that he looked weaker, he looked quieter, as if something very final inside him had closed. From that day on, I stopped hoping for anything from his children. Before that, however little it was, I had still kept one tiny piece of belief inside me that maybe sickness would wake them up. Maybe watching their father slowly fade would remind them of family. But after that night, after hearing them talk about property and say he was no longer their father, I understood that some roads go so far there is no coming back from them. And then he died. He didn't go in some loud, dramatic way like in the movies. There were no long last words, no grand final moment at all. Just a morning so frighteningly quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in places where people are standing very close to the final line. He had been extremely tired the night before. I sat beside him almost the entire night. At times he drifted in and out. At times he opened his eyes and looked at me as if he wanted to say something, then let it go. Near dawn, his breathing changed. Slower, shallower. I called the nurse. They came in, checked him, adjusted the machines, said things very softly that I can't even remember now. All I remember is his hand in mine and each weak squeeze fading, then getting lighter, then gone. People like to think the moment someone dies is when the whole world stops. But that's not true. The lights stay on. People still walk the hallway. The machines keep making their sounds. Only your own tiny private world collapses, while everything else keeps going with a cruelty that feels unbearable. I sat with him for a long time after that. I looked at the face of the man who had been my husband for 20 years. In that final stillness, his face suddenly looked terrifyingly unfamiliar. Not because it had changed, but because for the first time in 20 years, I understood what it meant to look at the person you love and know they will never open their eyes again. I thought that would be the greatest pain in this story. I was wrong. Because as it turned out, my husband's death was not the moment when people showed the full extent of their cruelty. His funeral proved that. I can hardly remember how I got through all the arrangements. I only know that during those days, that young woman was beside me more than anyone else. She was the one who helped me call the funeral home, choose the flowers, arrange the schedule, answer the phone, receive visitors, and handle all the small practical things that if I'd had to do them alone, probably would have broken me halfway through. Some things are so small that outsiders never notice them, but those are the very things that save you when you have no strength left. A glass of water set down at exactly the right moment. A door opened for you. A quiet, "You sit down, let me handle this." A hand resting lightly on your shoulder at the exact moment you think you're about to fall apart. That young woman was not his biological child, not his blood, not his family name, not bound to him by any obligation at all. And yet she was the one helping me carry the invisible coffin of those days. His biological children came to the funeral too. They arrived well-dressed, on time, with expressions that were sad just enough that no one could criticize them. If you only looked at the surface, you probably would have thought they were grieving children mourning their father. But I had lived with them far too long to believe appearances. I remember very clearly the moment they came up to me. The house still smelled of lilies and polished wood. People were moving around softly. My husband's portrait was set at the front, his face in the picture as gentle as ever. And in the middle of all that, the first thing his children wanted to know was not whether he had gone peacefully, not whether he had been in much pain, not whether he had said anything in his final hours. The first thing they asked about was the estate, the will, what he had left behind. I stood there, in black, on the day of my husband's funeral, looking at his two children, asking about money before the incense on the altar had even burned down. And I remember feeling nausea rise straight into my throat. That was the moment I understood that some people do not come to mourn the dead. They come to take inventory of what death has left behind. I wish I could say that by then I had completely let go, that after everything that had happened, I no longer cared what my stepchildren thought, what they wanted, or what they deserved. But that would not be true. The truth is, even after the moment they stood at their father's funeral and asked about money as if they were discussing a debt that had come due, there was still a part of me that wanted to keep things decent. Not because they deserved it, not because I had forgotten what they had done, but because they were his children. 20 years of being a man's wife is long enough to understand that some ties in the human heart never fully break, even when they've been rotting for years. I knew how much my husband had suffered because of his children. I knew how angry he had been, how disappointed, how deeply they had wounded him. But I also knew he was still their father. And because I loved him, I couldn't help thinking about that. When the lawyer went over the papers, and I learned that after all the hospital bills, invoices, medications, and debts were paid, the remaining estate was $40,000. My first thought was not that I should keep it. I honestly thought I should give part of it to his children. Not because they needed it more than I did, not because I was afraid of what people might say, but because I had lived long enough to understand that sometimes fairness is not about giving people what they deserve. Sometimes it is about being able to tell yourself that you did not let bitterness lead the way. I truly thought that, if the story had ended at the funeral, maybe that is what I would have done. If his children had just stayed quiet for a while, If they had given their father's death even a small space of dignity, if they had left that house with even the faintest trace of real grief in the air, maybe that is what I would have done. But once greed loses all sense of shame, it never knows where to stop. A few days after the funeral, that young woman came by the house with her daughter. I was still so drained that even walking through the house felt like moving through deep water. Everything after a death looks exactly the same as before, and yet at the same time, nothing looks the same at all. His coat was still hanging in the same place. The chair he always sat in was still in the corner. The mug he had used for the last time was still in the dishwasher because I hadn't found the courage to touch it yet. The house was full of little things like that, and it is exactly those little things that bring a person to their knees when no one is watching. She had only come to ask if I needed help with anything. Just like before, she did not carry herself like someone who had come to ask for something or wait for anything. She was simply there, and after sitting quietly for a few minutes, because she knew the grown-ups were talking about sad things, her little girl quietly started glancing toward my husband's study. I knew what she was thinking about. Those old paperback books. Those worn, cheap little books with cracked spines and wrinkled covers. The kind my husband treasured, not because they were worth money, but because of the stories inside them. I remembered very clearly what he had told that little girl, that if she loved them, one day she could have them all. I did not take that as some polite thing adults say to children. I knew he meant it. And more than that, I knew that in the final months of his life, seeing that little girl read those books had given him one of the rare joys he still had left. So that day, I told her that if she wanted, she could go in and pick out a few to take home. Her eyes lit up instantly, but she still looked at her mother as if waiting for permission. Before the young woman could even answer, I smiled and told her it was all right, that my husband would have been happy knowing those books were being kept by a child who truly loved them. The little girl stepped carefully toward the bookshelf. She reached out and touched the spine of one book, then turned back to look at me as if she had just been allowed into some sacred place. And right then, my husband's son walked into the house. I don't know how long he had been there. I only know that the second he saw the little girl standing in front of the bookshelf, his face changed almost immediately. No one touches anything in this house. His voice came out so hard and sharp that the little girl startled, and the hand holding the book pulled back at once. I turned to look at him, still thinking maybe he was just reacting impulsively out of grief. I was wrong. He walked straight into the room, his eyes fixed on those books, as if he were looking at a safe that had just been cracked open. He said if I let anyone take even a single book before he had checked them, he would call a lawyer. He said those books could be worth money, could be collectibles, could be worth hundreds of dollars each. And no one had the right to give anything away before the value had been determined. I looked at him. For a few seconds, I truly could not process what I was hearing. Cheap old paperbacks, books he had bought from clearance tables, thrift stores, roadside boxes of used books. Books he had loved his whole life for what was inside them, not for what they cost. Books a child had loved because a decent man had sat down and told her the stories in them. And yet there he was, in front of that little girl, with his father's memorial portrait still in the house, looking at them like a pile of assets that might be slipping through his fingers. I said very calmly, or at least I tried to keep my voice calm, that they were just old paperback books, and that his father had told the little girl she could have them if she wanted. He cut me off immediately. He said he didn't care what his father had told anyone. The sentence fell out of his mouth so coldly that I could feel the whole room drop in temperature. He said verbal promises meant nothing. He said everything in that house had to be reviewed, appraised, and divided properly. Just then, his sister arrived too, and instead of seeing what was happening and feeling ashamed that her brother was barking at a child over a few old books, she stepped right into the argument like it was the most natural thing in the world. She asked whether he had gone through the inventory yet. She said if there were any rare books, they couldn't risk losing track of them. And within minutes, the two of them were arguing right there in the living room about who had the right to decide first, who would hire the appraiser, who got to claim what. They went back and forth, grabbing at stacks of books, flipping covers open, inspecting spines, arguing about resale value, market value, saying, "Don't let her give Dad's stuff away for free." I still remember exactly how the little girl slowly backed closer to her mother. One hand clutched the thin book she had barely managed to take down. The other grabbed at her mother's sleeve. Her eyes were wide, frightened, unable to understand how grown adults could become that aggressive over a few old books. And I stood there, in the house I had lived in for 20 years, watching the children of the man I had just buried turn their father's memory into a cheap little property audit. If you ask me what moment truly made me lose all hope in them, it was that moment. Not the day they called me a gold digger, not that birthday dinner years ago, not the ice-cold phone call on my birthday, not even the funeral. It was the moment I watched them fight over worn-out old paperbacks in front of a child, with the eyes of people panning for gold in ashes. Because that was when I understood something with perfect clarity. They no longer saw their father in anything he left behind. They only saw price tags. In the end, to satisfy that obsession, they actually took the books to be checked. Each one was worth 25 cents, a quarter. I remember that when I heard the number, I didn't laugh. I didn't feel vindicated either. I just sat down in the chair by the window, looked out at the backyard for a long time, and felt a hollowness so deep there was no room left for any loud emotion at all. 25 cents a book. They had made a scene, frightened a child, and dragged their own father's memory through something ugly and cheap, just to protect something worth less than a can of soda. There are moments in life when a person can't even feel anger anymore, because the ugliness has gone too far, and all that's left is the sensation that something inside you has just died for good. I think that was the moment the last part of me, the part that still kept trying to defend them simply because they were his children, finally died. I still remember very clearly the afternoon I called that young woman over. I was sitting at the dining table with the paperwork in front of me. I had looked over it again and again, as if staring at it long enough would make that $40,000 tell me what to do with it. But money never speaks for itself. It is the conscience of the person holding it that has to speak. When she arrived, I asked her to sit down. She looked worried, probably thinking I needed help with something else. Her daughter sat in the chair near the door, holding the old book I had given back to her after the argument the day before, as if she was afraid someone might come snatch it away. I told her that my husband had left me the remaining estate after all the expenses, and that the amount was $40,000. She went still for a second, but said nothing. Then I told her I wanted her to have it. I don't think I will ever forget the look on her face in that moment. Shock, disbelief, then immediately shaking her head. She said no, said she couldn't take my money, said she had never helped us for that reason, said it wouldn't be right. And that refusal made me even more certain that I had chosen the right person. I told her I knew she had not helped for money. I knew that better than anyone. I knew she had been there on the most exhausting nights, the darkest days, the moments when all I needed was for someone to stand beside me so I wouldn't collapse. I knew she had worked 2 jobs and still come by the hospital. I knew she had brought my husband something his own biological children had never brought him: uncalculated gentleness. I knew her daughter had given him rare moments of joy in the final stretch of his life, just by sitting on the floor, turning the pages of those old paperbacks, and asking innocent questions about the characters. I knew the man I loved had smiled for real when he was with the 2 of them. And I also knew, deep down in my heart, that if he had still been strong enough to say one final word about that money, he would not have wanted it ending up in the hands of the people who showed up only to take inventory of what death had left behind. I told her, "You're not taking anything from anyone. You're simply receiving what your kindness deserved a long time ago." She started crying. So did I. But I did not change my mind. I told her to use the money to pay down some debt, to rest a little if she could, to give her daughter a childhood with a little less struggle in it, to make life feel a little less like a non-stop race against bills. I did not see it as charity. I saw it as putting the last remaining part of my husband exactly where it belonged. Then I turned to the little girl. I told her those paperback books were hers now, that she did not need to ask anyone else anymore, that no one had the right to frighten her for loving something a dead man had once loved. She gathered the books into her arms, carefully, reverently, almost more reverently than someone her age should have known how to be. She looked up at me, then over at my husband's picture on the shelf, and she said very softly, "I'll take good care of them." That one sentence alone made me have to turn my face away, because after all the fighting, the bitterness, the numbers, the questions about who got what, a child was the only one who truly understood how to treat the memory of someone who had died. When his biological children found out, their anger exploded exactly the way I expected. The phone rang non-stop. The messages came flooding in. Some were as long as indictments. Some calls were nothing but shouting. His ex-wife jumped in too. They called me cruel. They called me crazy. They said I had let outsiders manipulate me. They said I had stolen from his children what should have been theirs. I listened. I read. And for the first time in many years, I felt no need to explain myself at all. Because when someone has decided to see everything through greed, no decent explanation can still find a way into them. My own daughter found out too. She wasn't angry that I gave nothing to my husband's children. She understood far too well what I had been through, and even more than that, what my husband had gone through at the end of his life. But she was hurt that I had not left any of that money to her either. I did not blame her for feeling that way. Hurt is not always selfish. Sometimes it is simply a very human ache. I told her she had her own job, her own life, and one day she would receive what I leave behind. But this money had never been hers. It was not a reward, and it was not some fair split among the children in the family. It was the final remainder of a man who had gone to the very edge of illness, disappointment, and the loneliness his own biological children had caused him. And I wanted that final remainder to be placed where there was gratitude. A lot of people might disagree with me. They might say blood is blood. They might say that no matter what his children did, they were still his children, and a wife has no right to change that. But I have lived long enough to know that some truths are hard to hear. Blood is not always the one standing beside the hospital bed. Blood is not always the one carrying the cup of water, pulling up the blanket, staying overnight at the hospital so an aging wife can close her eyes for a little while. Blood is not always the one who can still make a dying man smile when a little girl asks how an old storybook ends. And blood certainly stops meaning very much when the only thing a person cares about in the end is how big their share will be. The day my husband died, I did not just lose the man I loved. I also lost the very last illusion that if I were good enough, patient enough, generous enough, then one day other people's hearts would feel ashamed and change on their own. Not everyone knows how to feel shame. Not everyone knows how to love. Some people grow older in years, but the human part inside them stays small forever, too small to hold gratitude, decency, or another person's pain. It took me many years to accept that. And if you ask whether I regret it, the answer is no. I do not regret giving that $40,000 to the young woman. I do not regret giving those paperback books to her daughter. I do not regret choosing kindness over blood. If there is anything that still haunts me, it is only that it took me far too long to understand that family is not always the person who carries your last name. Sometimes family is the one who stays when everyone else has already walked away. Sometimes family is the one with no obligation at all and who still comes. Sometimes family is a 25-year-old woman working 2 jobs a day who still stands in a hospital hallway at midnight, and a little girl holding old paperback books as if she's holding a sacred piece of the dead man's memory. And the others, the ones who shared his blood, in the end only proved one thing I will carry with me for the rest of my life. A person can be born from you. That does not mean they know how to love you.